10 dragons flew toward the mountain that morning. By sunset, the Valyrian peninsula belonged to one creature for the rest of its life. We talk about dragon-on-dragon combat in Game of Thrones, almost like it started with Vhagar and Arrax above Shipbreaker Bay, or with Daemon and Aemond over the God's Eye. But that was choreography compared to what happened over the 14 Flames 6,000 years before the first Targaryen even drew breath. Because what happened over Valkyrian wasn't a duel, it was an extermination. In parts 1 and 2 of this series, we covered the White Colossus's origin and the night it destroyed the village of Valyria. But we haven't told you the event that made both of those stories possible. The reason there were no other large dragons left on the peninsula. The reason the Colossus hunted alone for 300 years. Tonight, we're going back to its prime, roughly 150 years into its 4-century lifespan, when the god-born Titan was at its peak aggression and peak territorial fury. And by the end of this video, you'll understand why 10 wild dragons weren't enough, why 100 wouldn't have been enough, and why the Valyrian shepherds who witnessed this battle stopped praying for the Colossus to leave and started praying for it to stay. Before the White Colossus, the 14 Flames were crowded. Dozens of early wild dragons nested across the volcanic chain, creatures that would later be classified as the ancestors of the 6 great breed lines that the Valyrian Freehold would one day engineer into weapons of war. These weren't the refined Colossi, Embermaws and Sky Shriekers of the Dragonlord era. They were raw, wild and unselected, products of volcanic evolution after escaping the terrifying competitive region in the east, rather than Valyrian magic and highly developed breeding programs. But they were still dragons. The largest proto-dragons on the peninsula had wingspans in the 300 to 500 foot range. They weren't small. Creatures that could level forests, boil rivers, and reduce entire herds to cinders in a single pass. Any one of them, transported to Westeros at the time of the conquest, would have rivaled even the great Balerion, Vhagar, and Arraxes. And for decades, they tolerated the White Colossus the way smaller predators tolerate a larger one, by avoiding its territory and hunting elsewhere. But the Colossus was still growing. At 150 years old, the White Colossus, though the shepherds simply called it the Pale Doom, had reached roughly 1,200 feet in wingspan. Not yet its final size, but already so massive that its hunting range had begun to overlap with every other dragon's territory on the peninsula. It was eating their prey, collapsing their nesting caves with the tremors of its landings, fouling their thermal columns with its heat signature, and it was getting worse every year. The proto-dragons were being squeezed out of their own habitat by something that simply would not stop expanding. Dragons are not pack hunters. Every scrap of lore we have, from Septon Bath to the Valyrian breeding archives lost in the Doom, confirms that dragons are solitary, territorial, and violently hostile to other dragons that enter their space. The only exceptions are mated pairs during breeding season and mothers guarding clutches. Which is why what the proto-dragons did was unprecedented. The surviving shepherd accounts, oral histories passed down for centuries before anyone wrote them on parchment, describe a gathering. Over the course of several weeks, proto-dragons from across the 14 Flames began converging on a volcanic ridge roughly 20 miles south of Valkyrian. Not all at once, in pairs, in threes, landing on separate peaks within sight of each other, but not close enough to trigger territorial aggression. 10 in total. The scrolls give rough descriptions. 3 were dark-scaled, almost black, ancestors of what would become the Obsidian Colossus line. 4 were mid-sized, fast, and loud, proto-stormclaws or early sky shriekers. 2 were heavy-bodied and reddish, built for sustained flame rather than speed. And 1 was pale grey, nearly white, the second largest dragon on the peninsula. The shepherds called it the Lesser Ghost. Something had triggered a survival instinct that overrode 6 million years of solitary behavior. They weren't cooperating. They were converging on a shared threat, the way dire wolves circle something too large for any single animal to bring down. The question that has haunted Valyrian scholars ever since. Did they coordinate? Or did 10 separate creatures independently arrive at the same suicidal conclusion on the same day? The assault began at dawn. The 10 proto-dragons launched from the southern ridge in 2 loose waves. The 4 fast flyers went first, climbing high, using the early morning thermals to gain altitude above Valkyrian's caldera. The 3 dark-scaled heavies came next, flying low and direct, heading straight for the mountain's shattered southern face, where the Colossus roosted. The 2 red-bodied dragons and the lesser ghost hung back, circling at medium altitude. The shepherds on distant hilltops watched the formation approach Valkyrian and waited for the mountain to react. For 3 agonizing minutes, nothing happened. Then the Colossus emerged, not slowly, not groggily. The mountain's face exploded outward as 1,600 feet of bone-white fury launched into the sky with a speed that should have been impossible for something that size. The roar hit the shepherd camps like a physical wall. Children were knocked flat, livestock stampeded, and the signal fires that should have been lit were forgotten because the watchers were on their knees. The fast flyers struck first. They dove from altitude, raking the Colossus's back and wings with talons, trying to tear membrane. It's the same tactic Sky Shriekers would use against Colossi in the Sky Wars thousands of years later. Death by 1,000 cuts. Get above the big one, stay fast, and bleed it. It didn't work. The White Colossus rolled in midair, a maneuver that should have been aerodynamically impossible for a dragon of its mass, and caught the lead proto-Sky Shrieker in its jaws. The crunch was audible from 20 miles away. One bite. The proto-dragon's spine severed, its wings went limp, and the Colossus dropped the carcass into the caldera like discarded meat. 9 left. The 3 obsidian line heavies hit next, coming in low and fast with sustained flame. Their combined fire raked across the Colossus's chest and underbelly. 3 streams of red-orange dragon fire concentrated on a single target. Against any mortal dragon, this would have been devastating. Against god-born scales thick as castle walls, it was warmth. The Colossus answered with a single breath. That white-blue column of divine fire swept horizontally across the 3 heavies. The first took the blast full in the chest and simply came apart. Scales shattered, flesh vaporized, bones scattered across the sky like burning rain. The second banked hard, but caught the edge of the flame across its left wing. The membrane ignited instantly. It spiraled downward, screaming, and hit the mountainside with enough force to trigger a rock slide. The third heavy pulled clear, barely. 7 down, 3 dead, 4 wounded or scattered. What happened next took less than 2 minutes. The remaining proto-stormclaws made one final coordinated dive, all 3 at once, targeting the Colossus's eyes. One actually reached the skull. Its talons gouged a shallow furrow across the Titan's brow before the Colossus's tail whipped around and swatted it out of the sky with the force of a battering ram. The lesser ghost, the second largest dragon present, pale gray and ancient in its own right, never attacked. It watched from medium altitude as the others died. Then, as the Colossus turned its furnace-bright eyes toward the last survivors, the lesser ghost folded its wings and dove for the sea. It was never seen again. The remaining proto-dragons scattered. 2 escaped south. 1 vanished into cloud cover and may have survived. The rest were hunted over the following weeks as the Colossus patrolled the peninsula in widening circles, burning everything that flew. Within 50 years of the battle, no wild proto-dragons remained in the 14 flames. You might think that's the end of the story. The apex predator won. The competitors were removed, natural selection in its most brutal form. But here's what the shepherds noticed in the decades after the sky went quiet. Without other dragons competing for prey, without territorial pressure forcing the Colossus to stay near Valkyrian, the god-born Titan's hunting range expanded to cover the entire peninsula. It flew further, stayed airborne longer, and started targeting things it had previously ignored. Giant land beasts, coastal wildlife, and eventually human settlements. The battle didn't just clear the skies. It removed every check on the Colossus's behavior, every natural limit that the presence of other predators had maintained. was gone. The shepherds had watched 10 dragons try to kill a god and fail, and now they lived alone with that god, in a sky that belonged entirely to it. Thousands of years later, when the first Valyrian dragonlords began breeding their own colossi, they studied the White Colossus's skeleton and found something the shepherd accounts had missed. Embedded in the Titan's rib plates, healed over and calcified into the bone, were the broken talons of at least 6 different dragons. The wounds had scarred, the bone had regrown around the fragments. The Colossus had carried the evidence of that battle inside its body for the remaining 250 years of its life. It won completely, but not without being touched. And when the Valyrian dragonlords looked at those embedded talons and calculated the force required to penetrate scales that thick, they arrived at a conclusion that shaped their entire military doctrine. If 10 wild dragons couldn't bring down the White Colossus, then the only thing that could kill a colossus was a bigger colossus. The arms race had its blueprint, and it was written in 6 broken talons buried in bone. The White Colossus lived longer than any dragon in recorded history. So there is much more to tell. Subscribe to find out.